and welcome to Climate Change from Space with Canadian Space Agency astronaut Joshua Kutryk. My name is Rachel, and I'm going to be your host for today's session. I'm going to ask that you share in the chat where you're joining us from today. If you're also from a school or organization, please feel free to share that in the chat. We'd love to hear where you're joining us from today. As I said, my name is Rachel, and I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator for Take Me Outside. I'm joining you today from Treaty 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Inuit, and the Dakota, and also the national homeland of the Red River Métis. Manitoba, where I'm from, is also the traditional land of the Nishnawak and Dene. I'm joined to you today by Julie, who is also from Take Me Outside, and she will be supporting this session and highlighting your questions in the comments. So feel free if you have any questions or need any assistance, Julie's here on the back end to help with things. Before we get started, Take Me Outside would like to acknowledge and celebrate the diverse environment and peoples across Turtle Island whose lands are the places, spaces, and teachers for our work. The speakers and presenters this week come from a wide range of nations and places across Turtle Island. We want to begin by acknowledging that outdoor learning recognizes humans as an interconnected part of the natural world, as part of the relationship that has been stewarded since time immemorial by Indigenous peoples who have lived here before colonialism and continue to live here and thrive here despite it. We begin with gratitude and utmost respect for the land and all our relations on and above within her. We offer gratitude and respect to the many Indigenous peoples who continue to protect and share their deep relational knowledge to facilitate ongoing relationships with her. Sharing your languages of relationship, reciprocity, respect, and responsibility encourages the heart of outdoor learning. We also acknowledge that the work of truth and reconciliation is a journey of lifelong learning and work. We commit to supporting the educators in rising to the Truth and Reconciliation Committee's calls to actions numbers 6, 12, and 62 through 66. So this week, as you explore outdoor learning with your learners, we ask that you take time to learn and about and recognize whose traditional land or territory you reside, work, play, and explore on. You can use this resource that Julie has put in the chat as a great starting place. Tim Patterson, an Indigenous mentor and hiking guide from the Little Nicola Band, said, "It's not just about acknowledging the land or the people in particular, but asking what this knowledge and feeling compels you to do." So throughout this week, we hope this session and speakers inspire educators and learners from all walks of life to head outside and connect to the land. We hope you experience the way the land can love, nurture, and heal you. So I am extremely excited to welcome today's speaker, Joshua Kutryk. He is an experimental test pilot with over 4,000 hours of flying experience on more than 40 different aircraft types. Prior to joining the Canadian Space Agency, Joshua flew as a developmental pilot for the Royal Canadian Air Force in Cold Lake, Alberta. He has worked on a variety of flight test projects, including out-of-control flyings, simulator certification, and automated navigation and weapon guidance development. Previously, he served as a CF-18 fighter pilot, flying missions in support of NATO, UN, and NORAD commitments around the world. He's been deployed to both Libya and Afghanistan. Joshua was selected as an astronaut candidate by the CSA in July of 2017. He completed the 2-year astronaut candidate training program and obtained the official title of astronaut in January of 2020. Since then, he's continued to serve Canada's space program as an active astronaut at NASA. He's worked in different technical and operational positions, including from mission control as a Capcom during spacewalks and commercial vehicle proximity operations in 2023. He was assigned to the Starliner 1, a commercial crew mission to the International Space Station, where he will live and work for approximately 6 months. He will become the first CSA astronaut to be part of NASA's commercial crew program. Let's all welcome astronaut Joshua Kutryk.
Thanks, everyone. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm in Houston at the moment, but I tell folks I wish I was in Canada. Canada is where I'm from. It's where I went to school. It's where I wish I could be right now. I have to tell you that you are lucky to be in Canada and going to school in Canada, because it's such a pretty place. It is so beautiful, and there's so much opportunity. And of course, there's hundreds of other reasons, but yeah, you're lucky to be Canadian. I look forward to talking to you a little bit about what I do, a little bit about the mission that I'm preparing to fly and my past journey, and then to taking your questions, which we'll try to save time for at the end. Of course, I also want to talk to you a little bit about the themes of Take Me Outside. They're themes that resonate with me. I grew up on a farm. I have spent a lot of my life outdoors. It's where I like to be when I'm not working. That's still true today. Today, I still ride a bike every single day, sometimes for hours and hours on end just by myself. I like being in nature. Um, and I also think a lot, more so now probably than ever, about climate change. And that's because of my job now with the Canadian Space Agency, because of what I get to see happening to this planet, and because of what I get to see in terms of how space can someday hopefully help us to address the challenge. But climate change, of course, is all over. It surrounds us. You see it everywhere that you look. It's a generational challenge. I'm worried about it, but it's the young people in Canada and around the world who are going to truly make the biggest difference and help us to move forward and to do things better. With that, let's jump into a couple of pictures and then we'll save time for photos at the end. So if we can go to the next slide. This is a photograph from Cape Kennedy in Florida. And what you see here is a Delta Atlas rocket with a Starliner spacecraft sitting on top. This is the spacecraft that I'm training to fly on, coming up here hopefully pretty soon. It's a brand new spacecraft. We've been working to develop it and to build it and to field new technologies to test it. And that's been part of my work for the last several years now, is getting ready to fly this thing that you see in the photograph to the International Space Station, test the vehicle out on the way there, and then spend probably 6 or 7 months living and working in outer space, doing a bunch of important work that we'll talk to before getting back into that small little spacecraft and traveling all the way back to planet Earth. Let's go to the next slide. I like going here. This is another photograph from Florida. I live in Houston. We have all our labs and the simulators here, but we have all the hardware and the rockets in Florida, where you see this second picture taken from. I like going there because to me it's like looking out into the future. I think that space and rockets are what we had as airplanes 100 years ago, and what I mean by that is they're technologies that are transforming the world, changing the world. They're making what was impossible for so many of us, for so many generations, possible. And when you go to Florida now, you get to see that almost every day. Almost every day there's a launch, there's something going into outer space, be it a satellite or equipment for a business, or be it human beings going to the space station, soon going further onto Mars. But what you see is the future happening. You see the impossible becoming possible. You see us solving problems. And it's inspiring for me to go to this place and to watch. I can't wait for the day when we will launch from this place and I'll be in that vehicle. Next slide. Just one more, if we get one more picture. This is something that you'll see often in Florida these days. These are two rockets that have blasted off together, lifting something very heavy. It's from a Falcon Heavy rocket into orbit. And then these two rockets actually come all the way back to Earth and they land. And of course, this technology is changing all the time. If you were paying attention last weekend, you would have seen the same company catch a ginormous rocket booster that fell back to Earth. They caught it with mechanical arms. It's about the size of a 747, one of the largest planes in the world. This is hurtling back towards Earth at hypersonic velocities, multiple times the speed of sound. And they captured it. They caught it. They're going to refuel it and learn to fly it again, which is what you see going on in this photograph. I like to bring this up because this is in my time. I remember only 10-ish short years ago doing this, what you see doing in this photo, what has become so routine now. It was impossible. People never thought we would be able to do this, land rockets vertically, refuel them and launch them again. But we've figured it out in just the last couple of years. And it's just a nice little symbol for me of how fast technology is changing, how fast the world is changing, how fast things that engineers thought would never be possible are becoming possible. It's happening before our eyes. We go to the next slide. A little bit about me and the outdoors. I grew up on a farm in Alberta. I've always loved the outdoors. I've always spent a lot of time in the outdoors. You see, I'm salmon fishing in one photo, paddling a canoe in another. I still paddle a canoe a lot, by the way. I have one here in Houston. and I use it on the ocean waters and some of the lakes around where I live. I'm inspired by the outdoors. It brings me back to kind of ground zero. It clears my mind, and it makes me think about the bigger picture of spacecraft Earth, which is our home, the only planet we've been able to live on so far. Hopefully, we might see that change sometime with missions to the moon and onto Mars. But so far, it's all that we have. And we really need to focus on looking after it, especially now, as you all know. But being in the outdoors reminds me of that. And I'm grateful for the time that I'm able to spend there. Next slide. Picture from home. This is where I was a kid. This is just about 200 meters down the road from the house I grew up on. We farm cattle, Red Angus to be exact, and that's a picture of me doing that, which is still something that I absolutely love to do. I have a lot of relatives, friends, sisters who are still in the business, and it's a very fulfilling way to make a living and an important job. Of course, it keeps you in the outdoors a lot and makes you think about the serenity and the beauty of home Canada, Team Canada there in what I think is the most beautiful country in the world. Next slide. More canoeing pictures. I like to do a couple of things. I like to fly. We're going to talk about that. I like to paddle things that can be paddled, kayaks and canoes, and I really like to ride bikes. So I spend a lot of time doing those three things. Next slide. I mentioned I like to fly. So where did this all start for me? I'm getting ready to go to space right now. Of course, it wasn't always like that. I never thought I would be an astronaut. I always wanted to, but I never thought I would ever do it. I never saw it as something possible. For me, this journey started here with flying. I was very passionate about flying, started flying very early in life. And I used that passion to guide all my decisions about what I would do and what school I would go to. I wanted to fly. I became a commercial pilot really young and a flight instructor. Eventually joined the Air Force, did military flight training, started flying bigger and faster things, and eventually started flying the F-18. Flew it all over the world. I went back to school many times. I always loved flying, operating. I wanted to fly the most complex, fastest things I could, but I also wanted to understand them. I was intrigued by the physics and the engineering of aviation, and so I always had this beckoning in my head, calling me back into sort of the engineering academics part of things. And that's why I ended up going back to university to become a test pilot. And then I spent many years as a test pilot, flying experimental work and doing a lot of work still on the F-18, which you see in this photograph. So next slide. I was selected gratefully, one of the best things that's ever happened to me in 2017. And I got to join this team, awesome team, best team I've ever worked for, and that's the Canadian Space Agency. What you see in this photograph are 4 Canadian astronauts. It's the current core of Canadian astronauts. You see me and Jenny in the center. We were hired together as the new astronauts in 2017. David St. Jacques is on the right side of the photo. He's the last Canadian to come back from a multi-month long duration mission in space. And Jeremy Hansen's on the left. Of course, he's getting ready to fly a historic mission to the moon, which we'll talk about. Selection is a long process. You have to be very devoted, and I think you probably have to be a little bit lucky too. It takes a long time. You're going to do testing for about a year of continuous testing being looked at by the Canadian Space Agency. And the group, of course, starts with thousands of people. I think we had about 5,000 candidates. And it just, as every stage goes by, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller until there's just 2 of you left. And in this particular case, it was Jenny and I. Next slide. What happens when you get selected? Well, a lot changes in your life. We moved to Houston and we started a new life here. We started working, training at NASA. We basically go back to school. So we work for the Canadian Space Agency, but we start training with NASA. It's about a 3-year program to be certified as NASA qualified astronauts. We spend a lot of time in books and diagrams. We spend a lot of time learning languages like Russian. We spend a lot of time underwater simulating microgravity. We spend a lot of time in the spacesuit. We do a lot of technical training, a lot of teamwork training in order to become certified, like I said, after about 3 years as NASA astronauts. And then we start to work for NASA in sort of on the job kind of trainings. Next slide. You see an example of that here. This is one of the mission control rooms in Houston. If you've seen the movie Apollo 13, it's actually a very good portrayal of what that looks like today. And this is one of those rooms. We control from these rooms all the spacecraft that are going into space and to and from the International Space Station. We control all the systems on the International Space Station. And we have astronauts, generally new astronauts, work in this environment. Always as an astronaut here on console. And that's something that I've spent a lot of time doing as we get ready to take the next step, which is going into outer space ourselves. Next slide. We continue to train. In training, this is an interesting photo because training isn't always, engineering kind of bookwork, which is what a lot of people think about when they think of astronaut training. It is a lot of the times, but sometimes it looks like this. And this is something we would call space analog training. In this photograph, there's 6 astronauts from all around the world. I'm in the middle, but we have Europe in there and Japan, United States, of course, and Russia. And this photograph's taken about 300 meters underneath the ground, below Italy, in fact. We were living and operating, working, surviving in this underground environment for 3 weeks, exploring a cave system, doing microbiology science on behalf of researchers from up top, from around the world, looking for different species, for example. But for us, from a NASA perspective, for the 6 of us, in addition to all that hard work we're doing and all the studies and research that we're doing in this environment, we're really training because we're in an environment that's high risk, high consequence. If you're in this environment, you have to always be really paying attention. The next 10 seconds in your life are more important than anything else, because if you do something even as silly as put your flashlight down and forget where you put it, you can all of a sudden find yourself in an extreme emergency situation. So we call these high risk, high consequence environments. From that perspective, they help us simulate spaceflight. And so we deliberately go into these space analog missions with the idea of learning how to work as team members in risky, dangerous settings like the setting that we face in outer space. Next slide. We spend a lot of time here as an astronaut. This is the astronaut gym at the Canadian Space Agency headquarters in Montreal, Saint-Hubert. Of course, we have to maintain a high level of fitness in order to be able to endure the stresses of spaceflight. Space is not a good thing for the astronaut body. It's very hard on the body. It causes us to age faster. So we have to spend a lot of time physically working out before the mission. During the mission, we spend about 2 hours a day lifting weights or running, and then after the mission in order to rehabilitate. We also spend a lot of time in the gym because we're studied continuously. Space has a lot of implications for medicine. There's a lot of things we can study in space with the human body and then bring back to Earth in terms of treatment and how to deal with different aging diseases, for example. So as an astronaut, we're technical operators, but we're also test subjects, and we spend a lot of time working out and being studied from a medical point of view. Next slide. This is the CAN4 patch that was revealed recently. So this is the patch, the symbology that goes along with CAN4. CAN4 is called CAN4 Canada 4. It's the 4th time that Canada is going to send an astronaut into space on a long duration, multi-month mission. And so what you see there, of course, is my name, but you also see things that matter to me and that matter to the Canadian Space Agency. I talked already about the beauty of the outdoors in Canada. I think it's the most beautiful country in the world. And you see that. You see in the bottom the Rocky Mountains, the green plains of Western Canada, like where I grew up, the maple leaf, because it is Canada that has given us the Canadian Space Agency, that has given us a space program, and that has given us so much more, of course. In the very bottom, you see a subtle rendition of the Silver Dart. That was the first airplane to fly in Canada. I like, of course, aviation. I'm fascinated with flying. It's what I've always done. But I like thinking about how much the world changed because of flying and trying to look forward and see how much the world is going to change because of what we're doing in space right now. I don't think people can predict that. You see the International Space Station, that's where I'm going. And you see the moon because that's where we're going Canada as a country and other spacefaring partners like NASA in the United States. I think in short order, you're going to see folks living and working on the surface of the moon, and you're all going to, your timing is such that you're going to grow up, and if you're interested in it, you're going to go into technical jobs where you're going to be scientists or engineering or even astronauts who are working in that environment on the surface of the moon. And that's pretty cool. That's going to change the world and for the better, I would say. Next slide. This is just a neat photograph of the spacecraft I'm supposed to fly on. It's Starliner. This was taken in orbit during one of its uncrewed test flights. So you see a couple of neat things with the vehicle. This photograph was taken from the space station. So you have the blue ball, our home, planet Earth in the background, and this vehicle in the photograph is approaching the space station. Next slide. There's the space station. That's what is supposed to be my home for about 6 months. It's pretty big. What you see in the photograph is the size of a football field. It was assembled over 20 years. The living conditions, the space that you have to live in if you're a resident here as an astronaut is not that big. It's probably about the size of a small house all combined that you might find in Canada, a small average household. But of course, it's not a house. It's all tubes and spheres and weird shapes that you float through. But it's, in the end, a floating laboratory. That's why NASA and its partners built it. It's because it's the only place in the universe where we can do scientific research. Everything you see in this photograph is in microgravity. So there's zero acceleration. At least that's the perception on board, and that allows you to do science, medical research, materials science, science to do with regenerative atmospheres and water, science that you can't do anywhere else but here, and science that allows us to take lessons, discoveries that we make on the space station, and apply them to some of the biggest problems that we have on Earth. Canada was a major partner in the building of the space station. We contributed the robotic systems that put this thing together, and that was no small feat. Everything in this photograph is moving at 28,500 kilometers an hour. Every bolt that was assembled robotically by Canada had to be put together in that environment, and it's been moving in that environment with that speed, microgravity, ever since. So it's a very challenging environment to work in, but Canada supplied one of the main systems that built it, Canadarm2, all the robotic systems, one of the main systems that is used on board every day to keep it running. And because of that, we're invited to send astronauts here every once in a while. And I'm, of course, very lucky and grateful to be in line to do that. Next slide. Just pictures from the space station. This is an astronaut outside the space station doing basically mechanical kind of work. Swapping out a gyroscope is what he's doing here. But you want to think of our life as an astronaut on board the space station in terms of two things. We do a lot of science, which I've mentioned, but we also do all the operations. So we have to run the space station, operate its complex systems. We have to fix everything. If things break outside, we have to put the spacesuit on and go outside and do these crazy spacewalks to fix it, because there's really no 911. There's no one you can call to come fix it for you. The astronaut has to be able to completely run the station, deal with anything that could go wrong, and that's why it takes so long. I mean, it takes years, probably 6-7 years on average of training before you know enough about the complexity of the International Space Station to be able to go there, live and work and deal with all the problems that you could encounter. Next slide. More pictures from space. You see some of the Canadian robotic arms here, which is pretty neat to see. The one in the lower left, it looks like many joints on it. That's called Dexter. It's an autonomous robot that is kind of always maneuvering itself around space station, working autonomously or with the help of ground controllers from Montreal or Houston. But it's always working. It's always doing things, unscrewing things, tightening bolts, swapping out computers, kind of just always moving along, keeping the station in prime working condition. Next slide. More pictures from me as a Capcom working to support some of the missions on the International Space Station, some of the test missions with new vehicles like Starliner from here in Houston, from our control centers. Next slide. A couple things at the end that I do want to talk about. I've alluded to this already, the fact that we're test subjects for a lot of medical science. That's an important takeaway, I think, for young Canadians. It's the idea that being in space is great for science. It's not good for our bodies. It's kind of like taking natural aging processes and hitting fast forward on them. So certain systems inside of me are going to age at maybe 3, 4, 5, 10 times the rate at which they aged for a normal person on Earth when we're in space because of the radiation, because of the lack of gravity. And from that point of view, it's not necessarily good for us, but it is super good for aging, super good for science because it lets us study things like aging, like osteoporosis, like brain diseases, a whole host of things we're able to study in space and then bring those lessons and those discoveries back to Earth. Next slide. Starliner docking. This was taken very recently, the last time the vehicle flew, and this is what it will hopefully look like someday soon when I'm flying inside of there. There's 4 people in that vehicle, planned to be 4 people in that vehicle, that is. And, we launch from Florida. We go into orbit around the Earth. We spend a couple of days catching up to the space station, going faster and faster and faster until we're ready to dock with it. That's obviously a highly choreographed exercise, bringing 2 things going tens of thousands of kilometers an hour together. But that's the name of the game, so that eventually the crew of 4, myself and 3 counterparts, can climb out of there and go into the space station and start our mission. Next slide. These are pictures from inside a Starliner. I'm testing systems here. Next slide. Starliner is supposed to land on the ground in the desert, but if things go wrong, there are some scenarios where we end up in the water, and so we're testing that here as well, just testing the mechanism by which we would get out of this vehicle if, because of a whole bunch of failures, we happen to land in the ocean. Next slide. Testing the seat. It's never been used before, right? So we have to test everything. This is just doing a multi-hour test on the spacesuit and the pressurization system and the seat itself. Next slide. I'm going to swap to questions here in a minute. I want to talk about 2 things real quick, though, and that's the Artemis II crew and climate change. Artemis II is a pretty cool thing. The coolest thing there's a couple cool things. This is a mission to the moon that's launching probably in the next year. It'll be the furthest and the fastest that any human being has ever gone in the history of human beings. First time anyone's gone back to the moon since Apollo. But the real cool thing about it that I want you to know is that there's a Canadian on board. And so from the whole world, NASA and all its partners, the one international partner invited to participate in this is Canada. And that's because of what we do in Canada. That's because of our engineering communities and our scientists and our innovators and our companies that have built things for NASA to use in outer space. So it's a great accomplishment for us. You see the crew here. Jeremy Hansen, of course, is the Canadian on the right side of that photo, and a very good, close personal friend of mine. Next slide. They're going to the moon as the first of many missions designed to send astronauts back to the moon to do sustained, permanent exploration of the moon. And the real reason they're doing it is to get ready to take that next giant leap, which is onto Mars. And I think that what I tell people is I think it's possible. I think if we do everything just right, if we deal with the big problems like climate change, if we prioritize right, if we collaborate instead of fighting wars down here, for example, it could happen. You could be the generation that sees that first human being on Mars. And that's pretty darn cool, I think, and testament to the gravity and the excitement of the times that we live in. Next slide. I don't think this is far away. Moon bases, plants on the moon, humans on the moon for multiple months at a time, if not years. This is stuff we're working on right now at the Canadian Space Agency, and you're going to see it happening in the next couple of years. These missions are planned, the hardware is built, it's happening here in Houston and other places. And The exciting thing for you is that this is the world you're growing up and graduating into. If you're interested in space and you're a young person in Canada, I think opportunity has probably never been bigger. I think the future has probably never been brighter. Next slide. Our home, planet Earth, as beautiful as it is, and I want to circle back to where I started today, we have to protect it. Being an astronaut has caused me to realize that. Next slide. It's also caused me to realize, I think, that some of the biggest solutions to some of our biggest problems, like climate change, are going to come from space. This is that same picture, our planet Earth, but it's as viewed from a Canadian satellite, RadarSat, so it's synthetic aperture radar imaging the Earth. But the point is that there's thousands and thousands of satellites in space that are designed to look back on Earth and inform us about the planet, about the effect that we're having on the planet, and about what we have to do to fix and to protect the planet. Satellites are changing the way we do things. Next slide. In agriculture and in fighting forest fires and in responding to disasters, in managing water resources and fishery resources. These are all things that we're doing much, much better now because we have access to space data. And it's one way of many that space exploration is going to change the world going forward. It's clear to me that our biggest problems, like climate change, are going to be solved in large part because of what we're starting to do in outer space right now. So with that, we can go to the next slide. And I'll turn the presentation over to the moderators. I thank you for your attention, and I really look forward to any questions that you might have, but please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joshua. That was such a great presentation. And I love how you brought it all the way back to why we must protect Earth and why we must, connecting it back to why we're all here this week, which is outdoor learning and connecting with the environment. So at this time, Joshua is going to take some questions from the audience. So if you have a question, you can pop it in the comments, pop it in the chat, and I can broadcast it onto the screen so that Joshua can answer. So we've got one here already from Don Morrison. So has a Canadian ever been on the moon?
No, Don, good question. You are definitely going to see that happen in your lifetime, though, I think I would say. NASA's starting to go back there now with missions. Jeremy's going to fly around the moon. But the mission after that will see NASA astronauts, so American astronauts on the surface of the moon. I think and I hope that it's only a matter of time, a matter of years before we get a Canadian lunar surface mission. At least that's my hope.
So someone wants to know, how does it feel being without gravity?
At first, it doesn't feel very good. Of course, I'm training to go to space. We spend a lot of time training for that environment. We do it a couple of ways. A lot of time underwater using neutral buoyancy to simulate microgravity. A lot of time in airplanes. We'll fly parabolic flights where we use aggressive maneuvering to expose ourselves to the absence of gravity or the perceived absence of gravity. Initially, I would tell you it doesn't feel good. It's not something the human body's used to. We didn't evolve for it. And so all your systems and your brain and your proprioceptors, they kind of go into panic mode. They don't know what to do. For a lot of people, that manifests as sickness. You get motion sick. And for some, it can take a long time to get over that. So initially, it's not good, but it's amazing how fast the body adapts to that and starts to live and maneuver and enjoy the environment of microgravity. And then it goes from being not good and sickness and all that to being something that's really, really awesome, feels great. You can do things that you couldn't even dream of doing, of course, on the surface of environment of Earth. And so then life becomes fulfilling. It becomes like a dream. It becomes like if you were a kid and you dreamed what it might be like to fly effortlessly through the air. Well, that becomes your reality. And then I think it becomes very enjoyable.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. This is a great question for you. How does the spaceship know how to get to the space station?
Wow, well, that's an awesome question. And the irony of it is, really, we're still doing it the way we did the hardest exploration missions hundreds of years ago. Hundreds of years ago, boats would leave and they'd cross oceans or attempt to go around the world. It was very dangerous. A lot of people perished, but they would navigate based on the stars. And I think our parallel today is very similar. We're not crossing oceans, but we're trying to go deeper and deeper into space. And the sailors, the astronauts on these boats or spaceships are actually navigating the same way. We use the stars. Now, of course, it's very different. We have technology. I don't have to look out a window and take careful measurements with a sextant. We have computers and technology that do all those measurements automatically, and we kind of just oversee it. But at the most fundamental level, it's the same. We use stars. We use the fact that we know where all these thousands of stars are, and we can put that into a database, take measurements, angles off them, and figure out exactly where our spacecraft is, exactly where another spacecraft, such as the International Space Station, is, and exactly what we have to do to get from point A to point B. It's obviously very complicated and difficult, but it's reliant on the stars, just like it was with ships. I think that's pretty cool.
So this person is asking, how does living in space for 7 months affect your mental health? So maybe with that being a theme that we're talking on this week, maybe Josh, how are you going to prepare for living in space and the effects that will have on your mental health?
I think mental health is one of the main challenges of a long duration space mission. My friends who come back tell me that. NASA knows that. We spend a lot of efforts training for the mental health challenges of long duration space missions. Some of the ways that we do that are obviously through just sitting around talking about the challenges. We also, that's one of the reasons we do space analog missions. Like I showed you a picture from caves. I just got back from a multi-week expedition that was underwater. So we go into environments that are scary, that are isolated, in order to expose teams to in some ways, similar mental health challenges. But I would tell you that that much is very clear insofar as one of the biggest challenges of long duration missions, one of the biggest challenges for sure that we're going to have with Mars is just keeping people mentally healthy, keeping teams functioning properly and effectively, dealing with different personalities, dealing with all the mental health challenges that are going to enter. On Space Station itself, we have a lot of ways that we try to help deal with this. You know, we can go places and be alone. We have connections to Earth. We can call. I can pick the phone up and call anyone on planet Earth. I can video conference with almost anyone on planet Earth. We watch movies. I'm planning to spend a lot of time running and riding a bike in space, actually, to help myself deal with the mental health challenges, because that's what I've always done here on Earth.
Amazing. So someone has a question about the Mars mission, wondering how long it's going to take for that crew to travel to Mars.
Long time. Back to the mental health challenge. So, of course, Mars and Earth are always moving, and how long it takes is it can be months or it can be years depending on when you launch. But if you launch at just the right time and you use the most advanced rockets that we have today, it's generally safe to assume that you're going to be call it a 7 to 9 month mission. So 7 to 9 months living in something like the International Space Station just to get to a Mars orbit. Then you're going to get into a smaller spacecraft that's going to take you down to the surface. And then you have to wait because, again, because of this motion of the Earth and Mars, you don't want to just turn around and come back to Earth. It would take you way too long. You're going to wait until the timing is just right to do that and launch again. So in the end, you end up with about 8 months to get there, several months of waiting for the planetary geometry to line up, and then another 8 or 9 months on the way back. You're talking about a couple of years. Sounds daunting, but again, it's not that different than what we were doing a couple hundred years ago with massive sailboats exploring the oceans. And I'm confident that someday, despite the distance and the time, we're going to see humans doing this as well.
Yeah. Okay. And I think we have time for one last question here. Someone wants to know, what started your passion about space? So what initially got you interested in wanting to be an astronaut?
I like space now because it's the elevating thing that I see in the world. It's a positive force. It brings countries that have nothing in common on the ground, like Russia and the United States, for example, and it brings them together in an environment where they work together as friends. It's developing technology, it's solving issues like climate change. So it's an exciting, uplifting thing. Space exploration is one thing. Someday is one of of a few things that make me excited for the future. That's why I love this job. That's why I do space. From a purely individual perspective, though, if I put myself in your shoes back as a child, why did I want to do space then? I think it comes down to two things. I was a very curious. I love science. I love physics, but more than that, I just was curious. I wanted to know how everything worked. And then the second thing was an exploratory sense. I wanted to explore. As a young kid, that was meant on a bike. Later, it meant in airplanes and mountaineering and some of the other things that I've done. But now it's the same thing, same reasons why I like this job today. It satisfies my sense of scientific curiosity, and it's all about exploring.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much again, Josh, for joining us today. It truly has been an honor to have you as part of this whole week focusing on outdoor learning. So please share in the chat, what was your favorite part about Josh's session today? What was maybe something you learned? As well, we want to know, how are you planning to get outside today? Now, as we're wrapping some things up here, just a few reminders. We do have another session later on today, a youth climate action panel with moderator Larissa Crawford. And for educators, we have another professional development session for you this evening. Tomorrow is Take Me Outside Day as well, where we're encouraging everybody to get outside and spend time outdoors. And maybe while you're outdoors tomorrow, maybe you can look up and you can see the sky. Maybe the moon will potentially even be out tomorrow that you can see during the daytime. We do also want to leave you with a few things here. Throughout the week, we want to see your photos and how you're getting outside. So feel free to share them with us with the hashtag Take Me Outside Day throughout the week. You can also share your photos with us by our email, which is info@takemeoutside.ca. We'll be selecting some prize winners from today's attendance. So those will be announced later today, and you'll get an email from us. But we want to thank Josh again one more time for joining us. And thank you all for joining us for this awesome session. And have a great day. Make sure you get outside, and we'll hopefully see you again some point this week.
Thanks, everyone. Have fun outside.